What's going on, guys? It's James back with a tech tip video. I know I haven't done one of these in a while, but I'm back, and in today's episode we're going to be taking a look at how to swap out rear wheel bearings on vehicles with solid rear axles. Now, I'm going to be working on the Capri today, but this process is applicable to many other rear wheel drive classic cars and some utility vehicles as well, like my pickup, for example. Let's get on with it. So in order to replace your rear wheel bearings in a solid axle vehicle, the first thing you need to do is remove the half shaft. Now, these are what transmit drive from the differential in your axle to the rear wheels. They have got splines at one end, those engage with the side gears in your diff, and then at the other end we've got the hub with the wheel studs where you mount your rear wheels, and the wheel bearing as well, and this is what we're going to be focusing on today, but a little bit later today, because first up I'm going to take you back in time to a couple of days ago when I removed these from the Capri and show you how that's done. Cue the DeLorean. Right, here we are with the Capri. I've got the back of the car jacked up and supported it on some axle stands, and I've already removed the rear wheels. Now, one very important part about this job, before you even start, is making sure you leave enough room at the side of the car that you're working on to be able to get the half shaft out, because you need about half a car width space to be able to physically remove the half shaft. If you don't leave that space, you're soon going to realize that was a terrible idea, because the only workaround then is going to be put everything back together and move the car itself. So as I'm removing both half shafts from the Capri, I've positioned it in such a way that I've got enough space at either side of the car to get the half shafts out. So let's do it. Alright, so the first thing I need to remove is the brake drum. Now, these things can be pretty stubborn if you haven't had them off in a while, so make sure you take the handbrake off, and then with a bit of persuasion you should be able to get it off. Now, I've had this off fairly recently, so in my case it should just slide right off. There we go. So with the drum off, we've now exposed the rear brake, so we've got the wheel cylinder, the brake shoes, etc. But thankfully we're not interested in any of that, because all we're going to focus on now are the 4 bolts that hold the half shaft into the axle. And to gain access to those bolts, you're going to want to turn the hub until the holes in the hub line up with the bolts behind, and then you can get your socket and extension through. In the case of the Capri, it's a 13mm, so I can get my socket in there, undo those 2 bolts, then turn the hub another quarter of a turn and get the other 2 bolts out. Okay, we've got those 4 bolts out, so now we can remove the half shaft. Now, sometimes, if you're lucky, these things will just pull straight out of the axle, but more often than not, they're going to need a little bit of force to pop them free. So what I'm going to try first, and to be fair, this works 95% of the time, I'm going to get the drum, I'm going to flip it over backwards and put it back on the studs, like that. Then I'm just going to install a couple of wheel nuts. So the idea behind this is we're going to use the drum as a sort of makeshift slide hammer. So I'm going to slide the drum forward on the studs and then yank it firmly backwards. And as it hits the wheel nuts, it should shock the bearing out of the axle casing. Now, that's the theory behind it anyway. Obviously, these drums are cast, so don't go 100% Hulk on it. Use your discretion. If you can't get it out using this method, your only other choice is to go and hire or get a slide hammer. Right, let's give this a shot, see if we can get it out. It's coming. Right, there you go, you can see how that bearing has popped out of the axle, so now the half shaft can be withdrawn. Now, I'm removing both half shafts, and half shafts, in theory anyway, are interchangeable, but it's always good practice to put them back in the side that they came out of. So I'm going to pull this half shaft out and then label it near side. Then obviously I've got to go around to the other side of the car and repeat this entire process. Oh, the glorious smell of gear oil. Don't miss that smell. Right, cool, that's gone pretty well. So all I'm going to do now before I move to the other side is bung the 4 half shaft bolts back in here just to hold this rear brake assembly in place, because I don't want it dangling off the brake line. So I'm going to do that, then maybe just give everything a clean up and then stick some tissue in the end of the axle here just so no crap gets inside. Right, great, that's one side down. I'm going to go to the other side of the car and repeat this entire process again. I'm not going to film that because it literally is exactly the same. And then I'll see you again when it's time to swap out these rear wheel bearings. Right, so here we are back in the present day, and I've got one of the half shafts secured firmly in the vise here, and up at this end we have the wheel bearing. Now there's actually 3 parts to this little assembly here. You've got the wheel bearing itself here, you've got its retaining collar here, and then you've got this axle plate here. Now this is really important as well, as this is what bolts to the axle to prevent this whole lot from ejecting itself out of the car. So this is the area that I'm going to be working on today. Now you might be looking at this wheel bearing and thinking, James, why are you swapping that out? It looks brand new. You are kind of right, it is pretty new, but as I explained in a previous episode, these are the cheap style wheel bearing for this axle, and you can tell that because they have this groove machined into the outer bearing race here. Now this is designed for an O-ring which is supposed to seal between the bearing and the axle when it's installed. Now you'll notice I said supposed, because in my experience they do not, and they leak all the time. It's really annoying. I think I've done 3 or 4 track days since I installed these wheel bearings, and each day without question I'm having to pull into the pits early because one of these axle seals is leaking and I'm getting gear oil all over the rear tyres. It's really annoying. So today I'm going to do what I should have done in the first place and fit a set of these SKF rear wheel bearings. Now these allegedly are what Ford used from the factory, and you'll notice how there's no groove in the outer race on these because it doesn't need an O-ring. It's made to such a tight tolerance that once installed should not leak. I hope I haven't jinxed myself there, but I'm sticking to it. Right, let's try and get this old bearing off. So the bearing and its retaining collar are pressed tightly onto the half shaft. So there's no pretty way about this. I'm going to have to cut them off with a small slitter disc in the angle grinder. Now you have to be fairly precise here because you don't want to go cutting into the half shaft, nor do you want to cut into this axle plate. So I'm going to go easy. A small nick isn't the end of the world, but try not to go putting any deep gouges in the half shaft or the axle plate. So I'm going to start by cutting off the outer race of the bearing and then focus my attention on the inner race and the retaining collar. Now you'll notice I've taken the guard off the angle grinder to do this, which is not advisable, but it does make this job a lot easier. Right, I've just tied the axle plate into position to stop it flopping around as I try and cut off this bearing, so let's get into it. Right, so that outer bearing race is split. I'm going to have to cut it on the other side and split that so I can get the 2 halves off. Okay, so that's the outer bearing race removed with all its ball bearings and stuff, so now I can focus my attention on the inner bearing race and the retaining collar. Now what I'm going to do with these is cut them as deep as I dare with the angle grinder and then just try and split them with the cold chisel, at which point they should just slide right off the shaft. Now I've already put quite a deep groove in this retaining collar, so I'm going to try and split this now, and then if that comes off I'm going to move on to the inner bearing race. There we go, so that's the retaining collar split and removed. I didn't even touch the axle shaft either. I could be a surgeon with that angle grinder. So now I'm going to focus on the inner bearing race and give it the exact same treatment as the retaining collar, and then get that off as well. Right, well, I didn't need to cut that bearing anymore. I just had a go at it with the cold chisel and it split, and it took a bit of prizing to get it off there, but now it's off. So that completes the removal side of this process, so I can get the half shaft out of the vise, get all this off the shaft, and then move on to installing our new SKF rear wheel bearing. Right, so I've got all that old stuff off, and I've given this axle a bit of a clean up and resecured it in the vise in an upright position, so now I can get on with fitting the new bearings. Now there's a couple of very crucial things here that you don't want to get wrong, because you kind of only get one shot at this. So the first is making sure you fit the bearing on the correct way round, because they're not symmetrical, at least not in this case. They aren't. There's a little lip on one side of the inner race, so that needs to go on the right way round. The second is, do not forget to fit this axle plate before you fit the bearing. You may think that's funny, like, why would you forget to do that? But honestly, it's so easy to do. So I'll fit the axle plate first. I'm going to fit that, drop that over the shaft, make sure it's the correct way round, like that. And now I can drop on the bearing. Now this needs to go with the lip on the inner bearing race facing the hub. So I'm going to drop that on the axle shaft as well, like that. Okay, now at this point we need to get this bearing into position. So to do that, I'm going to take one of the old inner bearing races here and just drop that over the shaft as well. Now I'm going to explain to you in a moment why I'm doing that. Right, so at this point, just do a quick sanity check to make sure you've got everything in the right place. So we've got our axle plate on and the correct way round, yes. We've got the wheel bearing on, correct way round, yes. And we've got our old inner race on the top of that. Now the reason that's on there is because to press this bearing on, I'm not going to be pressing it on, I'm basically going to be bashing it on with an old piece of scaffold pipe. Now you need a piece of pipe, I'm just going to slide that over the end of the shaft here. You need a piece of pipe that is a similar diameter to the inner bearing race here. If you go too big, it could possibly slide over it and then you'll damage the bearing. So it needs to be a similar size to the inner bearing race. Obviously it needs to be big enough to slide over the axle shaft, and then what you're going to do is basically just roughhouse this thing into place. You're just going to bring the scaffolding shaft up and then just smash it down on top of this inner bearing race, and bit by bit this bearing will hopefully get knocked down the axle shaft and into position. So I'm going to get on with that and we'll get this thing installed. I'm just putting a light smear of grease on here just to help with the installation. There we go. Right, let's have a go. I'm going to start gentle just to make sure the bearing starts correctly. Right, so slowly but surely she's going on there. We're about halfway now, so I'm going to keep going. Eventually the bearing is going to touch this face on the hub here, and then that's going to be fully installed. So I'm just going to keep whacking it on there until it touches the hub, and then obviously you're not going to be able to whack it any further. What I'm also going to do is I'm going to slip on an extra one of these old bearing retainer collars, because I'm getting to the point where that inner race is catching on here and it's not slipping over quite as easy. So I'm going to put on one of these retaining collars, then put on the inner race, and then continue to whack this thing. Now you may be thinking this is pretty rough. Well, it is, but unless you've got access to a press, I don't really see another option. I obviously don't have a press, so this is what I'm sticking with. Round 2. Fight! She going? Right, that is installed. You can sort of tell when it is fully installed because as you butt the bearing up against that hub, the sound of the changes. You know, it's a more high-pitched like ring because obviously it's not going to go anywhere. It's just butted up against that hub. So that's fully installed. So now I can get the scaffolding pipe off, get the inner bearing race off, get the collar off, get the proper retaining collar on that I've not cut a slit into, and then repeat that process and then smack that into position. Should be job done. New collar, old collar, scaffolding pipe. There we go, you hear the sound change. Boom! He's a rough lad, isn't he? But I think we is done. Let's get this off here. And there we go, new wheel bearing installed. Obviously I've still got another one to do. I've got the other half shaft, but I am not going to film it because it is exactly the same process. So yeah, that's how you get a wheel bearing off and a new wheel bearing on a half shaft. So I've installed 2 lots of confidence today, not just one, 2 whole lots of confidence, and hopefully this video has given you guys the confidence to have a go at this job yourself, because it's not really that difficult. You just need to be careful in some areas, especially when you're cutting off the old bearings. Now obviously I am not finished just yet because I still need to get these half shafts into the Capri, so if you want to join me for that process, we'll skip forward a few days and get on with that. Okay, we are back with the Capri and it's time to get this half shaft back into the axle. So it's basically the reverse of how you removed it. Just grab the shaft, slide it into the axle, navigate it in there as best you can. Now at this point it gets a little bit trickier because you've got to engage the splines at the end of the shaft with the gears at the side of the differential. So if you get it in there and then just give it a few turns, I think I've actually got it already there, and I can tell I have because if I turn the half shaft I can hear the diff turning as well. So those splines have engaged. Just get that axle plate the right way around and then push it in like that, and that axle is now back into the differential. So all I need to do now is get the 4 bolts back in. I'm going to have to lift up this back plate for the brakes, get that aligned up, get the 4 bolts in, and then that half shaft is installed. Right, cool, those 4 bolts are back in, so that axle is now secured back into the rear diff, which is great, and I hope this is going to solve our leaky axle problem. And I can't tell you how much easier it is to install those bearings than it is to install the ones with the O-ring on the outside, because they really do take a lot of beating to get them into place. So it's a lot easier to install those bearings. Hopefully they don't leak. It's going to be a win-win. Last thing I need to do obviously is refit the brake drum, and then that's pretty much job done. Right, that is another job down, another tech tip in the books. I hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget to give it a thumbs up if you did, and if you want to stay up to date with the channel and see more little tech tips like this, don't forget to subscribe as well. Thank you. We'll see you for the next tech tip.